stepped up and saying that it can recently. Last year, the Equal Employment and Opportunity Commission in the Department of Justice came together to share some guidance on how employers should avoid violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act through the types of algorithms that they use to automate hiring practices, and demonstrated a willingness to use existing laws to prevent forms of discrimination in the age of AI. And with that, quick rundown of all that that I've been doing. And I'd like to turn our attention now to our awesome panel here. And I'll just ask everyone to go down the line and introduce themselves and talk a little bit about the work that they do, and how carceral technology affects disabled people. And I'll start with, first we have Jonathan Flowers, who's an assistant professor of philosophy at California State University, Northridge. Jonathan, you want to kick it off?
Sure. My name is Jonathan Flowers. I'm an assistant professor at California State University, Northridge, where my research focuses on the intersection between race, gender, sexuality, and disability in technology, specifically how the aforementioned identities are made present in digital spaces and how algorithmic technologies are increasingly used to surveil, curtail, or otherwise police and organize marginalized communities. And so my perspective on carceral technology really proceeds from Foucault's understanding of carceral culture, wherein we're talking about a culture where the panopticon, the all-seeing eye, has become diffused as a kind of mode of surveillance. And insofar as this is the case, the majority of technologies, surveillance technologies designed to track, collate, or otherwise surveil populations within our own culture are themselves carceral technologies. So everything from your Amazon recommendation list to technologies which claim to predict mental health are themselves form of carceral technologies, and these technologies amplify extant structures of oppression.
Okay, thank you. And then next we have Dustin Gibson. He's Director of Access, Disability, and Language Justice at People's Hub.
Yeah, this is Dustin. I'm a light-skinned Black man with a beard. I have a black cap that says Free Palestine and an all-black T-shirt, like a door and some paintings. I don't know if they're visible behind me. Yeah, People's Hub, we're an online movement school that's rooted in popular education methodology we use. We're completely online for a bunch of reasons, access being one of them. But our main purpose is to, one, support disabled organizers that at times are doing things around anti-carceral methods of organizing, and then to be able to support groups that are on the ground that are working on a variety of things, from solidarity economy work to dismantling the global far right. But outside of People's Hub, all of my organizing has been like in prisons or in any form of institutions or nursing facilities, helping people get free. And one of the things that we know about the abolition of prisons and institutions is that we need to build up modes of community support and ways to assemble and come together and deliberate. And how that's determined by the state most of the time is through their algorithms on whether somebody is nursing home eligible, or whether somebody is a threat to community, or whether somebody is likely to commit another crime if they committed a crime before, based on like whatever data that they have gathered about this particular person. So we see it in risk assessment tools, or we see it in like long-term supports and services, and delineating who is disabled and who is not. So I guess my experience and my engagement with any of the carceral tech is from like a user, and myself being somebody that's disabled that has been through institutions, and somebody that is in solidarity and support with other folks that are attempting to navigate the systems or attempting to avoid it, really.
Thank you, Dustin. And next we have J. Khadija Abdurrahman. She's the editor-in-chief of Logics magazine at Columbia University's Insight Center.
So my pronouns, number one, I'm a little bit sick. So I'm light skinned, high yellow. So is my wall. So I might be kind of blending in with it as well. But my pronouns are they, them, any. A lot of my personal research has been on predictive risk modeling in the context of family policing. The majority of people that are targeted by family policing are living under the poverty line, and more specifically are reliant on public assistance. And there's like nearly 100% rate of disability with parents that are investigated by the family police. And there's also a complete like confusion and maybe math phobia as it relates to algorithms and, you know, the series of technologies that are marketed as artificial intelligence. And so I've spent a lot of time having conversations with people who are like, you know, not that I want the cops to take my data, but like, I want my kid back. Like, is whatever you're doing with the university and stuff going to bring my kid back? Like, that's their primary concern. And so I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out, like, what are the stories that we already tell amongst ourselves, meaning as like Black people, as a Black diaspora, that we can draw on for like conceptual frameworks and language and tools, because we already do know so much about these technologies. And shout out to Jonathan. I'm excited because I only know you from Twitter, but I heard you mention surveillance, and that made me think of Simone Brown, right? And so there's all of this knowledge that we have from the Middle Passages, and sometimes people need to have that information like activated, and so they can make meaning out of the like series of proprietary technologies that are like intrusively extracting into their life. Outside of my work on family policing, you know, I have the fortune and misfortune of being a diaspora of the Horn of Africa. And so I think a lot about settler colonialism and the ongoingness of slavery in the region as it relates to technology, including through the other slave trades that are rarely spoken about. And the last thing that I guess I will say is that I am the editor-in-chief of Logics magazine. And shout out to Ben Tarnoff and Moira Weigel and like the original team that started it about 6.5 years ago. But I've gotten the opportunity to come in and help relaunch the magazine as a like Black, queer, Asian magazine. And, you know, for right now, we got a lot of bread. I feel like one day I'll say free Palestine too loud and they'll take the money away. But for now, we have money, we can pay people well and compensate them for the kind of thinking that like often doesn't get platformed. And many of the issues are open access, including Beacons, which I guest edited last year, which just, for example, had somebody who was like non-speaking autistic, who was one of the, I think was the second person to graduate from college using it primarily an AAC device to communicate. But in general, yeah, we're prioritizing like incarcerated writers. We want to make stuff happen. So I'm just excited to be among all of you panelists and learn from you.
Thank you, Khadija. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between, predictive family policing here in the US and in other parts of the world?
Sure, I will say that like family policing in the US is very tied to like the social safety net, which essentially does not exist in most of the world. So that's like the primary difference. To the degree there is some kind of like similar functionality, we'd be looking at usually like the UNHCR kind of NGOs, child protection mechanisms, which there is some similarity, but I would say that especially now as I have the opportunity to travel around the world, the intensity of policing and this level of intrusion into the family by the state does not exist like anywhere to the degree that it does in the US or like somewhere like the UK, Western Europe, things like that. So I could say more, and I know that I mentioned this in my email thread, but I did want to say just a few things, if that's okay, about how disability is related to family policing. And I'll be short. One is just explicitly it's encoded as a risk factor by predictive risk models. So whether a parent has a disability is scored on the same axis as history of sexual assault, homicide, or strangulation. Shout out to Todd Feathers at the Markup for doing public records requests nationally, demonstrating this. Number two is being subject to family policing produces new disabilities. through the emotionally traumatic and physically abusive conditions of the system. And then people relying on public assistance and therefore legible within state archives used to predict risk have high rates of disability themselves and or are caring for someone who has a disability. So these are this reliance on interagency data sharing by predictive risk modeling, or I guess automated decision systems more generally adopted by the public sector, I think is unique because there is not the same capacity by the state throughout the, throughout the global South.
Okay, thank you. And to the wider panel, what kind of surveillance technologies have you seen in the work that you're doing that you're most concerned about? And I'll just allow people to chime in on there.
I'm generally concerned about all kinds of surveillance technologies. Before I forget, my pronouns are he, him. I'm a Black man with a mohawk wearing a gray shirt. So when I teach technology and disability, one of the things that I start with is how disabled persons become legible as disabled within the US American framework, right? Specifically for college students, right? They have to have a history of disability that is tracked medically through 504 plans, through IEPs that follows them throughout their educational career and is then taken up by the higher education system to determine the specific kinds of accommodations they need. So a student with a disability has been legible as disabled for their entire lives, but they've also been legible as disabled in the mode of datafication. They become a construct of medical data. And insofar as this is the case, given the ways that these kinds of data follow disabled persons around, for example, when I applied for my job, one of the optional questions I was asked was whether I had a disability, and marking that makes me legible within these systems in some ways. So the thing that I'm most worried about is all of it, given the ways that these assessment systems are becoming increasingly interconnected and interwoven. The same systems that communicate to determine, say, rental applications are also the systems that communicate and determine risk of recidivism. They're also the same systems that communicate and determine eligibility for particular kinds of educational funding and eligibility for, say, medical support. And this is magnified as you are increasingly marginalized. So I say all of the systems, due to their interconnection, concern me. So it's hard for me to pick out a individual worst system, right? Because these systems are all talking to each other, and insofar as they talk to each other, they maintain a kind of distributed nexus of oppression through these technologies.
Jonathan, I was curious, I know a lot of conversations take place in the policy space about putting guardrails on the use of technology that's adopted by governments. When you say that you feel like they're all connected and there are no safe ones, do you feel like there should be just a general ban, or that that there are some sort of safe way?
So under a white supremacist, ableist, hetero, patriarchal system like the ones we're living under, there is no safe way to use surveillance technology, because the structures of our society that these technologies are continuous with will always tend towards marginalization, right? So we can look at things like predictive policing, the ways that they are frequently deployed against Black and Brown communities. And insofar as this is the case, they've given that over 60%, at least I think this was the case in 2016, over 60% of Black and Latino incarcerated persons self-reported with a disability. You are literally looking at a piece of technology that criminalizes disability at the same time as it criminalizes being Black, right? And this proceeds from the ways in which our society is organized around white supremacy, ableism, and other structures of oppression, right? And so guardrails, I guess guardrails are a nice fantasy, But because these technologies are continuous with a society that is predicated on these structures of oppression, I do not think you can realistically deploy these technologies without, say, human oversight. And even that is a tenuous kind of thing, because the kinds of oversight, well, one, the folks responsible for developing these technologies are not interested in oversight. They think it's an impediment to technological development. And two, the folks that you might get to oversee these technologies would also be continuous with the kinds of problematic structures. So as I've been fond of saying, the only good way of using predictive analytics or other algorithmic platforms within an institutional context is for auditing. It's really good at finding patterns in data. So if you want to know if your, say, hiring practices, as Amazon found out the hard way, if you want to know if your hiring practices are, say, massively sexist, train a algorithmic platform on your hiring data and see what kind of applicant recommendations it spits out. If it spits out only recommendations for, say, straight white dudes, then it's telling you something about the patterns of hiring. Just so you could use them for auditing purposes, but even then, I wouldn't trust the use of algorithmic platforms in that way because of the cultural tendency to treat the results of these platforms as objective, as neutral, as disconnected from any social context.
Yeah, thank you. Dustin, any thoughts on how carceral technology affects disabled people or the types that you're most concerned with?
Yeah, this is Dustin. I think like Jonathan, like pretty much summed it up in saying like all technology, and I'll just like add to that and say that all technology, when used by the state and specifically police, military, prisons, any forms of institutions, and I just think about like also the skill sharing with it. Like if I'm to be concerned with ableism, it's not just, I'm concerning myself with the quality of life of disabled people, but I'm also concerned with the manufacturing and the creation of disability as well, and also disablement. So when I think about like, a technological war, like that is something that is like of great concern to me. Like I just left Liberia, and to see the impact of war and the prevalence of disability, how disability is created, how that is then, overlaid onto an infrastructure that is like lacking of like, roads, power, water, like these same issues pop up in like other colonies, right? Or other places that are occupied, like a place like Palestine, where disability is very prevalent, but then the ability to get your needs met is difficult because of like the social political like atmosphere. So we'll see that across the US, right? But it's not heightened or intensified in certain places. In prisons it is, in institutions it is, in reservations it is, in barrios it is, in hoods it is, but that doesn't mean that it's everywhere. But I just think about like the use of technology by the prisons and police specifically is something that is concerning. Like we see places like Chicago has the $33 million cop academy they just built, or they're building. Atlanta, people in Atlanta have been resisting a cop city, which is 380 acres of forest land, in which they'll turn into a police training site where they'll be able to skill share with Israel and other nations that are worried about like being able to surveil people more effectively. And even in Pittsburgh, where I spent a lot of time, like the city bought a old school building for $1 and it became a police training site. But I think about like these sites of importance as places where you incubate like what technology is needed. Anybody that organizes in prison, that it's a situation of, you get a win, there's a victory, there's an accommodation that's met, there's progress on like, people's needs being met, and then the prison finds another way to like subvert that. And that's the continuous process of reform of a prison, right? That's what it means to reform, is to change something. And they do that through the use of technology. So I haven't seen an example ever of the police, prisons, or institutions getting technology and it being for the betterment of people and not the betterment of the institution itself. So I can't like think of a scenario in which like these entities would have another technology and it would benefit people and not the institution. And that's why it's like, okay, we could have conversations about like specific, you know, tech implementations, but to me, it like boils down to like some fundamental things. Like anytime disabled people have ever been on a list, it has always turned out bad. So Jonathan mentioned like the list of special ed, like, right? Like these are registries that are being built. And we have like very like pertinent examples of why we should not like allow that to like seep back into how we make decisions today. One example of that is I'll think about like Pennsylvania, the prison system. There's like 60,000 people there. A couple of years ago, there was only one person that was, identified as autistic. So with a push to like, you know, figure out how many more autistic people are there in the prison system, what the state decided to do was to create like a sensory friendly unit to a prison that's in Pennsylvania when they started figuring out more people in the prison system were autistic. And all that does is make it easier to incarcerate autistic people. And it also adds to this carceral system. It adds more capacity, it adds more beds, it adds more cells. And that is like something that, you know, necessarily is not contingent upon technology, but it's contingent upon the data and how they use it. So I think a lot of like our natural like instinct is to say like, yes, we need more data on who is disabled, how they became disabled, what their condition is, but on the back end of that, like how is that going to be used? And there's not really great examples of it being used to actually benefit disabled people. It's typically used as a barrier. And to me, that is most highlighted in the long-term supports and services or the home and community-based services and how people are, you know, denied that on a routine basis, which then, you know, supports them going into institutions, nursing facilities, prisons, all of the such.
Yeah. Khadijah, you had something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, you know, I work with a lot of people for whom like they have a very rigorous critique of state violence, like that's their lived experience and it's something that they can draw on and understand very well. You know, I think like what those of us who are like researching these systems, you know, can sometimes bring to the table is like how this is transforming pre-existing practices of social control and surveillance, and even like maybe flesh out what does this word surveillance mean? Because surveillance operates at a similar valence to corruption. It's kind of something that everyone is like, sure, against, you know, there's really no stake to be like against surveillance in a certain way. The two things that I wanted to say is I'm thinking about like IBM and the Holocaust, right? And the guy who wrote it, he points out that it's not that the Third Reich wouldn't have risen, you know, without the IBM's punch cards and machines. But what IBM's machines allow, the Hollerith machine allowed to make happen is to identify and target people at scale. So a lot of what we're seeing with these systems of policing that were already terrorizing people, when you say guardrails, I kind of laugh because in family policing, like one of the reasons they love it is there are no guardrails. Like they can interrogate your child, you know, with no attorney or parent present. They can strip search them. I mean, like one of the like silver linings of COVID was that I think it violated child porn, that they couldn't strip search the kids over Zoom. But this is a system in which what you're originally accused of doesn't even need to be verified in the court of law. Like that's not even the judgment of guilt. Is there any credible evidence? So we're already looking at these horrific forms of policing. All right, so why does this other stuff matter? And so I think like other people have already spoken to is that, you know, data collection is essentially producing an archive. Okay, well, then what happens with this archive, right? Like when somebody poses the question, does the parent have a mental illness? Let's leave aside the fact that we already can establish that mental illness is not a causal factor for harm within a family, right? But what is activated? There's like a circulation of risk that activates a series of concrete systems. There's a project by Free Radicals and Stop LAPD Spying that's open access, I think on Medium, called Algorithmic Ecology, which I really love because it examined ShotSpotter, and it says, you know, our initial hypothesis is like garbage in, garbage out, right? So based on there being dirty data, we would think that the hotspots would have been located from within Skid Row. What they actually found, though, was that the hotspots were located around the perimeter of Skid Row. And so what these archives are ultimately producing is they're remaking space and creating zones of containment that are essentially invisible. So there weren't necessarily high rates of arrest within Skid Row due to the operationalizing of this automated decision-making system. But when people tried to exit, at the perimeters when they started encountering high rates of arrest, containment, and then like being either placed back in or having longer prison sentences and stuff like this. And so, I mean, I guess just what I was trying to add to the conversation is there's something like happening here on the question of scale. And specifically what I wanted to say about that is I think Foucault is important. I think the panopticon is important, but we tend to rely too much on sightedness within our analysis of surveillance technologies. And particularly like what I think can be missed out is like thinking about the rhythm and like listening to actually how systems operate. So actually only 4% of all kids who are families that come into encounter with the New York City family policing system have a disposition of removal where the family is separated. So what happens to the other 96%? The majority of them go through non-criminal proceedings, but that take up a huge percentage of their time. They're enrolled into all of these like ridiculous services that are supposed to be like trauma informed, blah, blah, blah. But they're setting them into this regimented schedule. And so, like these systems are very attuned towards identifying people who are not obedient with the 9 to 5 able-bodied time, whether they're high, whether they're on crib time, whether they just have a different set of attachments and political commitments that bring them in opposition to, either traditional forms of employment, just-in-time scheduling within retail services, things like that. Things that are deviating from the norm, and they're able to identify people at scale. Because if you're looking at, for example, like electronic health records data, and you're looking within a neighborhood in which there's like a high rate of missed appointments, and then there's always going to be a stratified category of people for whom they are like a further deviation from that norm. And these are the people we see hyper targeted, subject to like rates of like higher amounts of kind of experimentation that are then generalized again by this kind of like stratified form to other sections of the population. But I think for people who are thinking about policy, the question is, number one, I think like enforcing ADA, which I don't think will happen, but I think that just like is one tool to just make it cool how they are violent against disabled people. Number two, making it mandated that people have to give consent for their data to be used for all of these different use cases, which is impossible. So I mean, just ways to like create friction into the system to create like a legal basis for people to bring forward class action lawsuits for when they're inevitably harmed in the same way we see with like environmental protection.
Yeah, and you got straight to the question I was about to ask before we jump into Q&A, I believe, which was, I mentioned, and you mentioned the guardrails being laughable. But I feel like it's a thread in the conversations that take place in this space. But the DOJ guidance on hiring algorithms and violations of the Americans Disability Act, to the panel, briefly, we've got about 5 minutes before questions start, but do you think the government is getting more aware of, protecting people from discrimination when it relates to the use of these algorithms? Does that give you any optimism, or are there any pieces of policy that are demanding accountability or empowering people?
Yeah, I don't generally think the government is being made more aware, except insofar as they're concerned about the capitalist impact of surveillance technologies, right? Things like Amazon and Google and Apple using surveillance technology to target advertisements, so on and so forth. And that's about the end of their concern. Yes, they do have some concern about the use of hiring algorithms in the mode of discrimination, but that concern is about at the level of their concern about white supremacist violence committed by police forces, right? I don't see any real policy changes that give me hope, particularly because the state is increasingly reliant upon these technologies to surveil, contain, or otherwise separate out folks that they take to be undesirable or folks who do not align with what their image of a model citizen is. And to be one of the things that I am one of the things that I like to think about with this is the ways in which these same technologies are used to select for specific or specific kinds of disabilities, right? So for example, there's a ongoing conversation about the use of algorithmic technologies to select out autistic individuals and funnel them into jobs that suit their autism in particular ways, coding, the development of even more insidious surveillance technologies, which itself is the other side of the coin. How can we use, or how these technologies are used to transform a disabled person, someone who is viewed as unproductive, into a more productive member of the broader capitalist superstructure. And I think any legislation, most legislation, insofar as it's continuous with the other broader structures in which we say live, will essentially act to maintain the status quo in a variety of ways, and that includes an ableist, racist, carceral status quo. So I have no real hope for a legislative solution. I have hope for a collective action solution, but not so much for a legislative solution.
Yeah. And any other thoughts before we go to Q&A? To the audience, please feel free to share your questions in the Q&A there. Dustin or Khadijah?
Dustin, why don't you go, since we go in reverse order?
Yeah, I would thank you. This is Dustin. And yeah, I would just say that, like, blankly, like, that's not the interest of the government. Like, at least I don't perceive it to be the interest of the government to, like, figure out like a way to not surveil people. Because like Jonathan said, that's the project. That is the project. It's like doing that in an effective, efficient way. And this is like, I think this is like the example of like tinkering with the system, right? Like the reform measure. And this is why abolition is like, you know, such a welcoming and an offering, because it's asking us like a different set of questions around this. Like, to me, it's not, I guess it's not necessarily fruitful to see like, how do we change this current setup? But it's more like fruitful to say like, well, what do we do under a different type of setup, right? Or how do we actually protect ourselves against surveillance? Because it is happening. And I mean, it's always happened. Now it's just using different devices. But, you know, this idea of like being able to track people, being able to control them, like all of that. And I think for the disability communities, this is like of particular importance, because there is like, within ableism, a deep level of paternalism, a deep level of like pity, like disability rights movements, even, as you know, not necessarily like the most left or radical groups, have always talked about like things. There's a slogan, piss on pity, where because people are disabled, because they're being viewed as folks that wouldn't be able to be productive or in a capitalist society or be self-determining or self-sustaining, that there's an idea that we can just where decisions need to be made for them, where the surveillance is a benefit for them. And that is like a cultural shift, I believe. Like, none of my work is about changing hearts and minds, I should say that. So this is not things that I'm like volunteering to do. I think people do that and it's valuable, but that cultural shift needs to happen more so than a policy one, because then like we can self-determine. Like, that's what disability rights struggles have always been about. Disability justice now, it's about the ability to self-determine and be self-sustaining, and not in like, you know, an American exceptionalism or individual type of way, but really be able to like have agency to make choice and decisions for ourselves. And under the level of surveillance that disabled people face, like, we're not able to do that. I think about, you know, like even like senior populations, where there's now, you know, life alerts, or there's a wrist badge for people that have dementia. Like, these type of technologies then just like expand and proliferate, and it always captures disabled people, whether we use them on the basis of criminality, on the basis of age, on like, for whatever reason we use them, like disabled people are always caught in that, because ableism functions as like this system that is really concerned with like who is human and who is not. And any group that can touch on those margins at any point then has overlap with disabled people.
Yeah. Thank you, Dustin. Khadijah, any final thoughts before we jump into questions?
Yeah, very quickly, I was just gonna say, echoing everyone else, like my theory of political change is not like vote for the blue in 2022 or whatever. But I think like it's important we're not like too techno solutionist about like how these things end up getting adopted. I mean, because even when I look at stuff around electronic health records, there's like a tiered system, and I think like the hospitals in major cities have reached like tier 3 within this like 10-year span. Many rural and suburban hospitals have not made any progress and actually are like not out of altruism. They're just like not good at actually surveilling populations as much as people and governments and states would like, because they like, don't have good internet access. They don't really want to do it. Like, and all of these technologies, there's like a lot of friction, good or bad, like policing technologies are also labor management tools. And so from within policing forces, there's also resistance, and putting in like dummy data into the system in order to avoid like their own kind of accountability. And so I don't think there's like any like benevolent Democratic Party that's coming to save us. However, like I think the government is, many, many little competing fiefdoms from within each other. And so, sometimes there's things like facial recognition being banned in all of the like K-12 public schools in New York City. That said, like facial recognition is one of those spectacular instances, which is a lot easier for them to isolate for political points. And I know that you're running out of time.
Yeah. So thank you. And the first question from the audience here is, it says, Kari talked a bit about tenant screening algorithms that might violate the Fair Housing Act. How should we think about tech when it comes to surveilling existing tenants? Can we trust landlords that are installing smart devices? Might these devices be used to track and potentially evict tenants, especially those who are underprivileged?
So I just have one very important thing to say. Like one of the most famous cases around this were tenants in East New York and Brownsville, Brooklyn, organized against their landlord and a Mitchell Lama, which is like a form of like subsidized, affordable middle-class housing. People always forget about that story that they won. The facial recognition wasn't actually deployed. And I think there's like all of these assumptions about Brownsville and East New York that people thought it was just like a desperate situation, but they won. So people don't trust landlords. But like collective action does work. These things are not inevitable. And like there are actually a whole strand of like successes that have happened.
That's a good reminder.
Yeah, I was about to say what Khadija just said, like collective organization is a much better tool to push back against these kinds of technological implementations than any like legislative kind of thing, because it works, right? But also, again, don't trust landlords, right? We can't trust landlords, period, much less landlords that are installing smart devices. And this, I think, is a problem given the cultural capital of smart technologies and everything from hotels to Airbnbs to even vehicles, right? So yes, these devices will be used. So there's no might here. These devices will be used to track and evict tenants for any kind of violation on the basis of whatever judgment the landlord is making. And I think one of the things that we're going to start seeing happening is landlords including a consent to surveillance within their leasing agreements, which, given that leasing agreements are like EULAs, few people read the fine print, right? So one of the things that I think we'll start to see happening in the near future is the inclusion of some kind of rider about consent to surveillance. And insofar as that's the case, right, these technologies will be used to evict tenants.
Yeah. Anything to add, Dustin or Khadija? Okay. And one of the other questions that comes to mind is what sort of trends are you looking at in the future when it comes to people in the disability community and algorithms in the year ahead?
This is Dustin. I guess this is more so a question around just like social media. Like one of the things that came up with like the work requirements under the last administration. I mean, it still, exists now, but like the monitoring of social media to determine if somebody is capable of working. And, that has, a bunch of consequences for like people's benefits, the ability to stay in community, stay alive. But yeah, just wondering what Jonathan and Khadijah's thoughts were around social media, because this to me feels like something that is like, we control, like to a certain extent, like we control our activity there. But also like the added surveillance. I think I come to this with a disposition around like, what does it mean for organizers and protest, which is completely different than, living daily life.
I mean, I was just gonna say, like, when I approach a lot of people to write for Logics, right? Or I talk to people about technology, I'm usually speaking to like Black people, Indigenous people, and they're like, what do I know about this thing? I didn't pass calculus or whatever. And so, I think like a couple of decades of like coding boot camps has very successfully convinced people that like to do technology, to talk about technology is to be like a white dude in your mother's like garage, like, like who's about to get some venture capital real quick. And so I think like so much of that conversation has shaped how we think about technology. And for those of us who are not white, cis, hetero, Christian, male citizens of the US, right? Like we have not even been able to conceive of an existence in which we did not have to navigate and negotiate surveillance, right? And so I think this idea of like the libertarian who's like terrified peeking outside of his like what do you call it, blinds, blinds, is very prevalent and doesn't really capture the actual dynamics at hand. And so people in the hood call the Fed book for a reason, right? But the police is always out here, they're always watching us, but people have come up with all different ways to navigate and like live their lives. So I'm not necessarily feeling like panicked about social media and surveillance. What I have noticed, it's hard for me to think on like a year time scale, but like I get a lot of more calls than I used to from families who are white and middle class. But I would still say that there's not an understanding, like with the anti-trans children legislation in Texas, I saw these like white organizations who are like creating their own like special cohort of people who would be immune from investigation. And I'm like, y'all not even the primary targets. Like Black, poor, disabled, like rural, Appalachian, trans and queer kids have always been targeted, those polyamorous families, but they didn't necessarily have that like level of protection through a category that was recognizable through something like discrimination law and looking at fairness and bias. But yeah.
Anything to add, Jonathan? You got one more. The audience.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm not super worried about surveillance of social media, except insofar as the medical industrial complex and the researchers therein are using algorithmic tools to scrape social media data to generate language corpuses to see if they can identify people's disabilities from their social media usage, their habits of usage, the language they use on social media. So one of the concerns I have there is the transformation of social media as a site for, I guess, the surveillance and identification of potentially disabled persons, and then slotting them into a category without understanding their lived experience of disability. And this is even more problematic as we've seen through COVID, that online spaces have become a kind of necessary community space for disabled persons. And insofar as those spaces are now treated as sites of research, sites to develop better surveillance and policing technologies, we have a broader problem. But I'm not generally worried about like social media and surveillance. I'm worried more about corporate control of social media and what that means for the community spaces that many disabled persons rely upon for, say, mutual aid, resource sharing, community building, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and of course, those corporations control those algorithms and can determine what people see in their feeds. One thing I will note, you mentioned the corpus of language. There's certainly a number of studies that have found that language models trained, on corpuses of data various studies, I'm stumbling over the sentence, have found bias related to people with disabilities. So as we're in this conversation about ChatGPT and all that other stuff around us, that's worth keeping in mind. One last point out to the audience. If you have any other questions, let me know. But we've got one more question from the audience here, and that's, can you talk a bit about surveillance tech in the workplace and how that impacts disabled workers? What are some of the major issues that you've seen?
I mean, so like EAP programs and other kinds of mental health types of programs don't, at least in my view, have any guardrails on the kinds of data they collect and or supply to employers. There's a whole bunch of research that looks at sort of the emotional analysis, artificial intelligences, the eye tracking software that allows individuals to, or say prospective employers, to determine whether or not a person is a good fit in the ways in which these technologies are predicated on an assumption of a particular able-bodied kind of subject, and thereby exclude from consideration disabled persons. So pretty much, as Dustin said, all of the technologies that we're talking about, these carceral technologies, are work management technologies, and if thought of in that mode, pretty much every issue we think of where predictive policing and other kinds of predictive technologies is concerned applies equally well to a work environment. So if you have a bunch of surveillance technology tracking your users and one pings or develops a profile of a worker as disabled, you might quietly shuffle them out of the door to avoid a drop in productivity, or you might shuffle them to particular work tasks on the basis of a social perception of their disability. Again, the standout example is autistics are naturally good at coding, which is not the case.
Yeah.
That's my just two quick points. Is one is like very typically in like the common discourse or whatever, the antecedent to or like the origin story of independent contracting is thought to be Uber and kind of gig platforms, but I think we can see that much more in the Clinton's abolition of welfare as we know it, right? And so you have people beginning to work for their welfare benefits, often for like 54 cents an hour for like a single mother with 2 children at that time in like 1996, alongside unionized workers, typically like in city or government offices, right? And then when you're thinking about like worker management, a lot of those algorithms, and like Caitlin Rothenstall's accounting of slavery is really good on this point. Like that Bezos' algorithm, how many packages can you pick per second in the warehouse? We can trace that to how much cotton can you pick per second on the plantation, right? And so I think that's like an important way to like reframe some of these questions that we have around work. But then the last thing that I wanted to say is just my primary concern has nothing to do with bias. I feel like this has always like redirected people into the wrong direction. Forget about the fact that the data is dirty, all of those things. The big issue is like you see them advertising AI for like medical care for the poor, right? They are emptying out these institutions of any kind of resources. And one day the heist will be up. And disabled people, like we understand that there's like interdependence. You need like somewhat centralization of resources, scaffolding, all of these things. And so I think disabled people, whether they're labeled as like formally as such or not, are going to be more, some of the most vulnerable groups of people to this kind of not just austerity, but complete like robbery of basically what's happening of public resources.
Yeah. Anything to add, Dustin?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot has been said there. And yeah, like this, the ableism is also like, assigning value based on like what you can and cannot produce for like the purposes of like profit and being able to steal surplus and all of those things. And like, so in a work setting, of course, like technology has always been used to figure out how can you, one, produce the most at any cost, and that cost being to the detriment of someone's health, sometimes their life. So we see it in, Amazon warehouses all the time. But that is something that's like replicated almost in any workplace that I've ever been a part of, whether it's all disabled folks that work in my workplace or not. Like that's something that we replicate. So like I think like the response to this is like a different form of economy and practicing that, like really leaning in to solidarity economy, all of the principles and values that comes along with how we participate in governance structure, along with whatever economic practices we're using. Under this current setup, this shit is always going to be ableist, and it's like it's not possible to do anything different because the goal is like something that is in contradiction to what we actually need. And yeah, so like I mean, even the most well-intentioned, like we use any type of technology as a way to like block people out, and whenever we need to do that. And a lot of the times ableism has a thing to do with that, you know. Other isms have a thing to do with it too, but disabled people get caught in that as well.
Yeah. And I was going to add that I think hiring video call analysis, trying to analyze people on live video calls has had some unfair results as it relates to people with disabilities. And the same goes for e-proctoring exams, for professional exams in a lot of places. Is something that I found in my reporting is people with darker skin or people with disabilities would be flagged at higher rates in some instances for those types of tests. And of
Can
course,
I throw one thing in there? So, I mean, one of the things that I often say to people is that it's not that when we think about these things like e-proctoring and the kinds of workplace analysis technologies, it's not that we want these technologies to better capture disabled people. We want the technologies to go away, right? Because they perpetuate harms. And it's good that you brought up education, because a lot of the e-proctoring ed tech solutions disproportionately marginalize disabled persons, and this, to Khadijah's point, evacuates like the basic social structures of education, right? So you don't need a teacher to grade if you have a machine proctoring your exam, so on and so forth. So I think Khadijah's point about the evacuation of resources from social services is a good one.
Yeah, and this need to provide reasonable accommodation for employers who are using hiring algorithms, for example, gets to this point that you're required to provide people with other options. Well, thanks a lot for your time. I think that's the whole panel. Yeah, that's it. I mean, I'm not good on.
Thanks, everyone. I know there are a couple of questions that we didn't get to, but if you would like to share them with us, we can follow up with the panelists, or if panelists are comfortable, we can also share email addresses for folks to connect directly. But as our panelists talked about today, disabled people experience heightened harms from surveillance practices that further increase interactions with law enforcement, which generate arrest records and other data that in turn affect access to housing, employment, and other opportunities. And the proliferation of technology-driven surveillance endangers people with disabilities even further, especially disabled people who are multiply marginalized. So it's therefore critical to examine and center the impacts on disabled people in any decision about whether to deploy surveillance technologies within and beyond the criminal legal system. So in closing, on behalf of CDT, thank you for joining us today. Many thanks to Kari, Khadijah, Dustin, and Jonathan for such a thoughtful discussion and for sharing your insights and work with us. To Jamal Magmi and our fellow CDT colleagues who helped put this event together, and to our interpreters and captioner for helping us make this event accessible. Future CDT events can be found on our website at cdt.org/events, and we will follow up to event registrants with a link to the disability and surveillance report that inspired this conversation today. Thank you all.